So welcome all of you to this panel discussion, and we are really so excited together with Ma and Irene because we have been working on this painting, Flight to Freedom by Pacita Abad, for quite a few years actually, starting really for the exhibition Suddenly Turning Visible, Art and Architecture in Southeast Asia from 1969 to 1989, which incidentally just opened yesterday at the Mori Art Museum. So we traveled the exhibition to the Mori Museum, and it will be on till May. So if you happen to be in Tokyo and you can finally travel there, please do see the exhibition. We wanted to be there as well, but unfortunately with the travel restrictions right now, it's not so possible. But really, this painting came about because of Suddenly Turning Visible. And we were in discussions with the Pacita Abad Art Estate through Jack Garrity, who's really Pacita Abad's husband, and also the director of the Pacita Abad Art Estate. And I remember first meeting Jack Garrity probably in 2018, if I remember correctly, 2017 or 2018 at the Hong Kong Art Basel. And we invited him for lunch, and we talked about our interest in really looking into Pacita Abad and also our research into the Birasri Institute of Modern Art. And that was part of our research for the Suddenly Turning Visible exhibition. And so we invited him for lunch in Hong Kong, and we talked about it. And we talked about the importance of the social realist phase of Pacita Abad's works, which is not so well known, because Pacita Abad, is more known for her kind of her textile chupanto kind of works. And I said, this is a very important phase of a practice, which is very socially engaged, and we should, give some kind of focus on this. So we talked about Flight to Freedom because this exhibition by Pacita Abad, it was a solo exhibition at the Birasri Institute of Modern Art in 1980. The title of the exhibition was actually Portraits of Kampuchea. And later on, that exhibition traveled to the Boston University Art Museum, and it was retitled as Portraits of Cambodia in 1981. So the first exhibition in Bangkok, and then it traveled to Boston. So I'll talk about that later. So a bit about, and then from that discussion, we then talked about the need to conserve the painting and how we could then show it as part of Suddenly Turning Visible. So of course, Ma and Irene has been, very deeply involved in the conservation work, and now after the exhibition, it's really wonderful to see this painting kind of framed, because previously it wasn't framed, stretched and framed, and now on display in the UOB Southeast Asia Gallery. Okay, so a quick introduction about Pacita Abad. She was born in 1946 in Bosco, and that's really in northern Philippines. And she was born in a very prominent family, actually. Both her father and mother were congressmen and congresswomen, so very involved in the politics in the Philippines. But of course, if one was involved in the politics in the Philippines, it was really a very difficult period as well under the Marcos regime. Right, so I think her father was also victimized in a way, kind of involved in election fraud, and victimized by the Marcos regime. And so the family didn't feel safe in Manila at that time. And so she was then asked to, perhaps she would leave the Philippines, because she became very involved in the anti-Marcos movement. So the plan actually was for her to go to Spain, but she was in San Francisco first, and then she decided to stay there. Previously, she had already finished her BA in political science at the University of the Philippines. But then she continued her studies at the Corcoran School of Art in Washington. So from San Francisco, she moved to Washington. And then, of course, later on she married Jack Garrity, and he was a kind of a development engineer. And so he traveled around the world, and she kind of followed him, as he moved around the world. So very much similar to as what Lynette said, in terms of Yukin in the exhibition that you can, go later to see, the tailors and the mannequins. She traveled around the world extensively, so to Africa, to Asia, and everywhere. So, and eventually she also came to Singapore, right? And she died in Singapore in 2004. But of course, her most, I think, well-known work in Singapore will be the Alcove Bridge, yeah, which is near the Singapore Tyler Print Institute with all the circles. right? So I think it's really wonderful kind of legacy that she left to Singapore, which is why she was also so close to us. Yeah, so this is kind of the brief biography of Pacita, and I've also talked about how this painting, Flight to Freedom, kind of ended up, in our collection and very kindly donated by the Pacita Abad Art Estate. Yeah, so back to the exhibition itself in 1980, which was at the Piraswi Institute of Modern Art. So what was really very interesting at that time was within the context of the Cold War. Of course, the Vietnam War had ended in 1975, but there was, of course, later on the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in 1978. And of course, its subsequent occupation for almost 10 years in Cambodia. But that also ended the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot's regime in Cambodia. But it triggered a refugee crisis. And so there were many Cambodians, because of the Vietnamese invasion, who then escaped to the border of Thailand. So at that time, Pacita Abad was in Thailand. Her initial intention was quite interesting. She just wanted to go to to look at the wonderful scenery of Thailand, northern Thailand and northeast Thailand, and to paint. But then this refugee crisis happened, and so this painting itself. So she then began to be more interested in the refugee crisis, and she gained access into some of the refugee camps. And I asked Jack Garrity, how that was possible. Apparently, he knew some friends because he was a development engineer, so very much connected also in the world of diplomacy, and she could get access to it through friends as well. And she then decided to do something different, which I thought was so important. And if you look at her background, being a social, political activist already in her own country, which led to her kind of decision to leave the Philippines, she became very much involved in trying to kind of raise and highlight this whole refugee crisis that was unfolding already by 1979 and of course 1980. And there were refugee camps along the border towns, the border areas between Thailand and Cambodia. Right, so this is really a quote from Pacita Abad, and I'll read it because really the title of our panel discussion is also from this wonderful quote by Pacita Abad, and I quote, "It is difficult for an artist to isolate herself from events that are happening all around. Thus, when the Cambodian refugees began fleeing from the Vietnamese invaders and streaming for the shelter of Thailand, I became involved. I made several trips to the refugee holding centers on the Cambodian border, and these visits were reinforced by numerous meetings with refugees, journalists, relief workers, and medical teams. These experiences provided me with a deeper understanding of the Cambodian tragedy, and as a result, my portraits depict the faces and feeling of the displaced Cambodians and tell the story of adversity, bitterness, boredom, and seldom happiness." End quote. So if you look at this painting, Flight to Freedom, you'll see no one smiling. Of course, they're in a refugee crisis at that time, right? And these were the two exhibitions. So one was really portraits of Kampuchea at the Piraswi Institute of Modern Art in 1980, and later on he traveled to the Boston University Art Gallery in 1981. And you see Flight to Freedom actually on the cover. Right? So she really created this painting, which was the largest painting in the entire exhibition of 30 paintings. This was the largest, and really the highlight of the entire exhibition. And so these are some also additional quotes from Pacita Abad, kind of reflections. She was quite diaristic because she was really very much engaged on the ground with the refugees, and she was also reflecting on her thoughts, in terms of her very, deep encounters with them as well. So I'll just read one of the quotes, which is the second one on the left at the bottom. So one of the cruelest ironies in the plight of the refugees is that even though they reached a refugee camp, they were not safe. The fighting and constant sound of gunfire near almost every camp was a constant warning that the senseless savagery lingered. Mortars, guns, and blood, the refugees who have been through so much in the past, still suffered. So it wasn't just like in the camp and they were safe. They were still very much in danger. Yeah. And she also talked about the resilience of the refugees as well. So on the right at the bottom, and I quote, relentlessly she tried again, and this time she succeeded to get to the camp. She says softly but resolutely, I will not go back to Cambodia ever again, even if the Thais would kill me. I mean, these were really the feelings of the refugees at that time, right? Having forced to leave their own country, their own villages, and to settle in another country. So what Pacita Abad did, which I thought was really admirable, was that she didn't exoticize or kind of have a different kind of perspective of the refugees in a sense that she really engaged and knew them personally. Right? And it wasn't easy because there was, of course, a language barrier. Right? But she always said, she broke down those barriers with a smile, number one. And Pacita Abad has a great smile. And also her portrait. So she would start drawing and sketching the refugees. And then that completely broke down barriers. And the refugees would smile and they would get so excited. Oh, you are interested to make a sketch of me, where no one really cares about them. And in a refugee camp, right? So she would take time to then slowly build up a relationship with many of these refugees. So this is a quote. And she actually kind of displayed this text together with the painting. So they kind of like go together. And I'll read this. The camp is surrounded with barbed wire, and the perimeter is patrolled by soldiers to prevent anyone from escaping. There are a few trees, which are quickly becoming firewood, and the rest of the area is barren except for the hastily erected shelters. This is Sakyo, the 40-acre temporary home for almost 30,000 Khmer refugees. So this was one of the main camp that she was at, the refugee camp. The reason why this exhibition became so powerful in Thailand was that it raised really the issue of the refugee crisis, which you would be surprised, or in a way not surprised, was something that the government wasn't exactly, kind of like telling the people in Thailand that was happening. So her exhibition really raised, this issue because it was happening in the borderlands, right? So out of sight, out of mind in that sense. And even for UNICEF, and of course the UN was, doing its best, to run, of course, the refugee camps. It was all about numbers. It was all about how many refugees, how much food is going in, how much liters of water is going in, but never about the individual stories of the people. And so this exhibition really received a lot of attention because this was precisely what Pacita Abad was highlighting. And even, the people from the UNICEF acknowledged that, yes, it's not about the numbers, and the exhibition and her works. And the way she worked, that really, engaging with the refugees showed that. So you can see the other paintings, out of the 30 paintings in the exhibition, of individual portraits of mothers, children. Some of them are smiling over here, so they're also very resilient. And it was covered very, very widely, both in Thailand, but mostly in English, because it was mostly the English newspapers that were covering her exhibition. And they were precisely talking about that, the human cost and the human tragedy. Right? These are people, and not just numbers. Right? And of course, UNICEF, was trying to raise funds, so they had to put it in that way. But I think the importance of the humanity of these refugees was really something that Pacita Abad brought to the fore. So also in the Boston Globe, so this was when the exhibition traveled to Boston. It also garnered a lot of attention because there was great interest in the States about what was happening because of the broader Cold War context at that time. So I think in that sense, she raised awareness as well of the refugee crisis. Now, this is rather interesting. In 1981, when her show traveled to Boston, and you see the newspaper articles about the martial law lifting weakens opposition. So this was actually the year that Marcos actually lifted the martial law. So it's quite interesting kind of relationship because Pacita Abad left the Philippines because of the martial law and the Marcos regime. So 81, the martial law was finally lifted, and then they talked about her exhibition at the Boston Museum Art Gallery. So coming back to Singapore and how it's relevant here, I'm not sure if all of you know, the refugee crisis was a regional issue and of course a global one as well, and it continues to be such an important issue today. We actually had a Vietnamese refugee camp in Singapore at 25th Hawkins Road. So these are images taken of the refugee camp in Singapore. So I'm not sure if any one of you know about it. It's not something that's widely reported because, not surprisingly, many of these refugees were also coming to Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, and they were coming through the sea by boat, mostly. So most of these boats were turned away, the refugee boats. But of course, they were given water and food, and then they were turned away, largely. So you must be wondering, how did these refugees come to Singapore? They came when they were rescued by tankers and other ships. So when they were rescued by tankers and other ships who were coming to Singapore, then there is no choice because they have already entered Singapore. Right? So then Singapore then started to set up the Hawkins Road refugee camp between 78 to 96. Of course, 78 was really the start of the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, which triggered the refugee crisis. So it was a regional concern at that time. So it was estimated that more than 30,000 Vietnamese refugees came to Singapore, and from Singapore was just a temporary site because we did not take any of these refugees. Many of them went to France or other countries who were willing to take them. But this number of 30,000 also varies widely depending on which source you read. And of course, we have Singaporean artists who are also responding to the Vietnam or this refugee crisis, and one of them is actually Lim Leong Seng, who did this kind of collage. And it was actually reported in some of the Chinese newspapers in Singapore, and he kind of used these newspaper articles. He reads Nanming, so Nanming, over here. So here, Nanming means refugees, and kind of used it to create this kind of collage monoprint in 1980. So this is just to talk about how artists in Singapore were also kind of responding to the refugee crisis here back then. Okay, so I'm going to pass on to Ma and Irene, who's going to talk about the whole conservation process.
Okay,
over to you.
so yes, thank you everybody for being here. And well, you can imagine how exciting it was for us to conserve this painting with all the story that this painting has behind. So initially, when we start working ahead of the preparation of having this painting on the wall, there's a lot of work that goes through. So we engage into discussions initially with Eugene, to discuss about ahead of the donation of this piece to the collection. There were a few things that we had to come into place, like the idea that, the husband of Pacita clearly expressed that the will of Pacita had always been to have this painting stretch, which was really important for us to know, because we need to follow what is the artist's intention. So initially this painting had always been displayed as a banner. For us, from a preservation perspective, the ideal scenario was to have it stretch, but we had to have the certainty that that was the will of the artist, because otherwise we would have had to find another solution, which maybe wouldn't have been so easy and more challenging for us. But at this point, everything worked out quite well, because she wanted it to be stretched. For us, from a preservation perspective, stretching was the best option for this painting, due to its size as well. So we had discussions with the collection development team of NGS that also works in the acquisition part of the artworks, and together with the collection managers also of ACC, because this is a very, very big painting. Therefore, from being rolled to being stretched, there's a big difference on storage, and storage is always an issue that we have, because unfortunately, the storage is getting more and more crowded, where we don't have so much storage left. So yeah, but for us it was perfect, because it allowed us to do the proper preservation job for this piece to be able to be preserved for the future years. And we were part of the installation when Suddenly Turned Invisible came down. So that was a great opportunity for us to collaborate with our AEM colleagues to also have a proper assessment of the piece and do a proper condition checking. So before it went on the wall for Suddenly Turned Invisible, it had been treated by an external conservator, and she did a very good job, especially because she wrote everything that she did in her treatment report, which is something very important in conservation, because we need to document very well what we do in the painting, so that if in the future it's going to be treated by someone else, people will understand what has been done, also the materials that have been used, because that also helped us tailor what was the best treatment and the best materials we had to use for our future treatment. So we brought the painting down, and then before it was rolled, and then we had the opportunity to check all the areas of where the paint losses are, which are caused by having been rolled in a very small roller, because when this came into Suddenly Turned Invisible, it had been rolled in a 5 centimeter roller, which is like super small. And yeah, paintings need, I mean, of this size, you need minimum 40 centimeter diameter roller, which is kind of like a quite big roller. So definitely hadn't been rolled in the best condition. And this had caused all these losses and damages on the paint layer. But the external conservator had done some consolidation. So with the silicone tip tool, we just checked to make sure that the areas that she had consolidated were still stable after having been on display for all the months, because it was quite long, Suddenly Turned Invisible, correct? Because it lasted a bit longer, because it happened during pandemic as well,
Yes,
no?
exactly, yeah.
So yeah, everything was okay. So the condition was really good, which was great for us. And yeah, and then we were able to prepare the piece for it to be rolled. So yeah, these are all the losses that you still see here, because this is going to be a second phase of our conservation intervention is going to be divided in 2 processes. So this was the structural process of getting the painting on this new stretcher and frame. But now we still need to address the issues of the losses. And this is something that we were hoping to do here in the gallery. So it's more of an outreach part of also so people can appreciate and can be here while we do conservation, and they can see, because we work in the Heritage Conservation Center, which is quite far from here. So people don't get to come in there all the time to see what we do. So we thought it was a good opportunity. I mean, seeing how much Pacita put effort on people and effort on this painting is good, that people get to see what we do as well. So yeah, that will come later. Maybe we can tell you a little bit more about that.
So once the painting wall was installed, here there are some images of the painting on the table. And here we are showing some of the most important steps that we did. So in the first image, we have the physical accessioning of the painting. So all the artworks that become part of the national collection need to be accessioned, and they are done by a collection manager. In the second image, I'm not sure if you can see properly, but what we are doing here is actually removing all the stitching from the pull sleeve. So this painting, as you know, was originally being displayed, hung as a banner. So pull sleeves were placed on the top and the bottom. So we actually needed to remove it for later to do the rolling, because we wanted to avoid any thickness on certain areas. So those was removed. And in the third image, actually, we are showing part of the rolling process. Here, what we were trying to do is roll the painting to place it face down. Yeah, so as Mar mentioned, part of the conservation process is condition check. So on the bottom, you can see an image of us doing condition check. So we take note of the physical condition of the painting. That is actually a very important part. We also help ourselves to do so using different lighting techniques. So as you can see there, we were using raking light, which actually help us to see whether there are deformations. And I don't know if you can see properly, but we were able to identify diagonal and vertical deformations, which are likely being caused by being rolled in a very small roller. Yeah. And then the other images actually show the rolling process and the final painting rolled. So as a general rule, we roll the paintings with the paint layer face out. In the first image on the top, you actually cannot see because we use an interleaf to protect the paint layer. But yeah, so in the last image is the painting actually completely rolled. So for the preparation of the roller and also the handling structure, we work with the art and exhibition management team. And yeah, we created a roll with a big diameter and also one entire piece. And we wanted also the painting to be actually store suspended So that's why we created this, which is actually store hanging. So there's no points of pressure where the painting is resting.
Yeah, it's really quite amazing because
It
this whole
is.
roller that you see, it's custom made
It's
for
correct,
this
yeah.
painting on the right, the image on the
Yeah,
right.
we were so happy because we worked together with our colleagues and then we told them what we wanted and then they came up with this wonderful design, which is great, yeah, because when the paintings is rolled, there's a lot of mechanics that affect and physics that affect a painting being rolled because, I mean, a painting has a lot of layers. There's paint, there's canvas, there's ground. So all of these interact when it's being rolled and can really cause severe damage. So the fact that, as Irene was saying, that it's like hanging, it's not creating pressure. That was is the first time we do this. So yeah, it was great. And yeah, now we really want to keep this for future
Yes.
rollings.
We should keep
So,
it.
yeah,
right?
we're keeping
Yes,
it.
we
We're
are
keeping it with all
keeping
them,
it.
please. We want to keep
Yeah.
it. Because, yeah, I mean, this painting is not going to be rolled anymore, but we could roll all the paintings that may come into the collection because this is ideal. So, yeah, it was great because there's a lot of collaboration work in between all of us. I mean, this has really been a collaboration project. So here we start with the treatment.
Oh, with the treatment. So actually, the treatment, as we mentioned before, is divided into phases. The one that we're going to explain now is the first one, which is the one that we performed. And this project actually, it can be considered of a big scale because we had to plan, organize, and coordinate between NGS and ACC, and also between our own department. So just to give you an idea, the number of people involved, it was the whole painting section, which is 7 painting conservators, together with some members of the art and exhibition management team. So
Quite big.
quite big,
Big
yeah.
scale.
Correct. So yeah, actually, for us, it was very important. It was of a big scale because not only the size of the painting, but the fact that we had to do the treatment here in NGS, so a different setup. So we came for the planning in order to understand the space because we had to bear in mind all the treatments that we had to do and the space required to do those treatments, and also to be able to handle and maneuver the painting safely. So yeah, it also involves a lot of planning in terms of materials.
Logistics.
A lot of logistics, yeah.
Plus COVID, which
Correct,
also
yeah.
makes everything a bit more complicated.
Yeah. So here actually we have some images. Once the painting was unrolled on the table, yeah, here we're just removing some of the remaining stitches. And here is one of the first treatments that we did, which is the humidification of the sides. We did it in order to flatten those areas, in order to prepare to do strip lining. So the strip lining is, I mean, the main purpose is to actually reinforce those areas and had like some support, so we are able to actually stretch it on the auxiliary support. Yeah. And yeah, here are some images of the rest of the treatments. On the top right image, actually, you have, we did here an insert, so there was a missing part of the canvas. And for all the treatments that we do, the materials that we use are conservation grade, they have been tested, and they are stable. And also, in the bottom right image, we have Mar actually preparing the strip lining. And yeah, we use linen and also adhesive to adhere it on the canvas.
So because this painting, the fabric is really thin, the fabric she used is extremely thin, and because it has suffered from all this rolling all these years, we didn't want to add any tension or pressure on it. So we decided to do, well, first of all, maybe I comment on the stretcher. So we bought a new stretcher because there was no previous stretcher, and we decided to use an aluminum stretcher that was custom made for us in Holland by a company that makes stretchers for museums all over the world. And we were so happy because, I mean, these allowed us to put extra weight on the artwork because it's so big. I mean, it's almost 5 meters. It's 4.80.
Yeah,
so
480 by
adding extra weight to it, it was, you know, can just cause further problems. And also we didn't want that to I mean, we wanted to avoid that, definitely. So this stretcher has an aluminum component, which is great because it means that it gives us the strength to keep the proper tension of the artwork. And at the same time, it has the wooden profile, so that means that we can use it as a normal stretcher, so we can staple on it. So yeah, we were really happy with it, and yeah, it was definitely ideal for this painting. And then what we're doing here is something that painting conservators do, which is called loose lining. So this technique, in the past, paintings used to be lined, so they used to be glued on a new canvas, but that is something quite invasive, and also this is a very modern painting. It's oil painting and it's still drying. So this type of treatments have been revised, and now there's many other things that have been brought into the profession, which allow us to create give some stability to the support without having to add a glue and compromise the original canvas. So we decided to use these loose lining. Is a technique that consists in stretching a fabric on the strainer, on the stretcher, and then this gives the tension. We pull all the possible tension on this canvas, and then we stretch the original canvas on top of the stretched canvas on the stretcher, and then which means that we don't have to add so much tension in here, because this has also been widely researched. There's some kind of mechanics that work with fabric, which they create like a certain attraction. It's like a static energy. So when we put this canvas on top of that canvas, they create like a sympathy energy. They kind of like each other, and then it sits nicely on it. So it's like creating a bed, in a way, for this to sit on. Because as you can see, when we were stretching these loose lining canvas, there's like a lot of deformations, and it goes through because we're stretching it not on a rigid support. So we wanted to avoid all of that as well. So we use this polyester, also conservation grade canvas. That is inert and won't transfer any kind of gassing to the original canvas. So yeah, this was ideal because we really pull all the tension in here, and when we stretch this on top of this, this one just sat nicely and we didn't have to pull too much. So yeah, that was the idea behind this. So here you can see in the bottom photo the scale of this thing. We had to do it in the corridor of the loading bay because we couldn't fit it any other place, because we needed quite a lot of space because you need to move around. And also positioning. The painting was not 90 degrees square, so because she had painted it, with no structural support behind, with no auxiliary support. So we had to find how to place it and how to place it so that all the areas were inside the stretcher. And then on the top photo, you can see my colleagues examining, again with a raking light, to assess that there's no deformation. Actually, we're super happy and super impressed of how flat it looks like. Because considering it was hung here as a banner for many months, and then it had been rolled in such a small roller, you can't see any deformations now.
No.
So yeah, we're so happy, and it's such a good achievement that definitely everything worked out. So here in this image that you see the reverse of the painting, so this is a preventive conservation measure that we use. So conservation looks more and more into using preventive measures, because if you use preventive measures, you will prevent from damage from happening. So this is something that conservation is going more into, exploring possibilities and things that can help us avoid damages. So this is a polycarbonate backing board that protects the painting from any impact that could be caused on the canvas, and it could cause a damage, a hole, a bulge, a dent, many things that happen actually in paintings on canvas. And it also protects from dust going in there, and also because it's transparent, we can still see the reverse of the painting, because it's important to have like an open vision of everything to assess that there's nothing happening. Because if you put something that is not transparent, especially in this climate, not in this environment control, but you can start having things grow in there, like mold. So, definitely not in this environment, but yeah, it's good that we use this thing because we can always have a proper vision of what's happening behind. And then the last photo, you can see how the painting was transported from the loading bay down here where the conservation labs are, and when we carried the treatment, to this space in the galleries, which was also quite challenging because the door is just nice. It just fitted nicely through it. So yeah, it was very exciting moment to just be moving it here and then hanging it here. It took quite a lot of our handlers, and yeah, and the painting is here now. And the second phase of this, as we were mentioning before, will consist in infilling the areas of loss and retouching. So maybe that is something we can discuss now after on how we want to do that.
Sure.
So yeah, this is it. This is us.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we thought we will kind of have a nice kind of conversation, and also any questions that you might have. And also we could talk about the painting itself.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so maybe we
Yeah.
can just stand up and have a look, and please do join us if you have any questions. This is a great time to talk about it, and really the purpose of the in-gallery talks is to have the works, in front of us as we talk about it. Most of the kind of these marks that we see here, it's caused by the rolling.
Yeah,
Rolling.
correct.
Am I correct? From the earlier small, how many cm roll?
5 centimeters.
5
Very
centimeter
slight.
roller.
Yes, very
Something
small,
like that.
very small.
Very
yeah.
small.
Yeah, very small roller. So we do see a lot of the marks. So initially, when the first conservator, when she came in to work on it, it was mostly to stabilize.
She did
the
retouch a
things.
bit. I mean,
And
because I
retouch
think
a
there
bit.
was like a
Okay.
constraint on time as well. And she did retouch. I think she focused especially on
the
the face
faces.
areas to make sure that, the people were portrayed correctly and there were no losses in the face. So yeah, she did a quite good job because, I mean, that is stable and is fine and there's no issues there.
Yeah. So what is amazing about this painting, when it was first shown in 1980 at the Birasri Institute of Modern Art, was really how this was the largest painting on display, and the rest, as you saw, were mostly portraits of individuals or families, or it could be a mother and child. But this painting kind of brought everyone together in a sense of kind of highlighting the magnitude of the refugee crisis. And so this is a crowd. And a group of refugees coming in a sense, but they are also very individual, right? Which I think was really important that we kind of focus on the faces in the first
Yeah.
round of the
Correct, yeah.
conservation
Yeah.
when we displayed it, so that one could see their expressions at that time. And of course, we could notice many of them are actually kind of also barefoot. And they are actually refugees who are having to travel long distances to the refugee camp. And as you read earlier, even when they reached the refugee camp, there wasn't a guarantee of safety. Right? They could still hear the gunfire and mortar being fired. So, and of course, some were also disabled, because by then the war was already happening since 1978, when Vietnam invaded Cambodia, right? So it's kind of the whole human tragedy, but the sense of movement, the sense of kind of, they're taking everything that they have, they put it on their heads, or they're carrying with them, and they're kind of moving to the camp. So I think the top part is quite interesting for me, because this is where their kind of entire life's belongings, in a way, is being carried on their head. So I would think perhaps, Maya and Irene, when we think about the faces, we might want to put a bit on the, their belongings at the top. I think that's another different kind of sight line almost, kind of bringing the horizon line a bit upwards to look at all these things.
Yeah. True, because
Above
it's a little
them.
bit disrupted there because
on the
there's
top.
like some big areas of loss there.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's quite. Another interesting part is, of course, Vietnam or Cambodia or many countries, they're not culturally homogeneous. There are also people from the mountain, the highlands. So you see some of them, I think, also represented here, and of course the lowlands as well. So it's kind of a very culturally diverse group of people. Of course, there are Cambodians coming to the refugee camp, but also the children. So I think that's the kind of challenge of this painting. It has got so many lines, right?
Yeah.
We have the sky, and then we have all their belongings on their head, right? And then we have the faces, and then we have the children, kind of below, right? So it's kind of, it's amazing, like the different
It's like layers.
Yes.
Yeah.
layers
Yeah.
that we have to kind of look at. So it's not like one focal point. It's almost like a Chinese hand scroll painting, when you unroll it. And in a sense, so it's kind of having so many different layers that one has to kind of look at. Yeah, is there anything from the conservation kind of perspective you want to talk about?
So for us, I mean, when you go into retouching, I mean, in this second phase, which is going to be retouching, I mean, you can see the areas of loss are quite extensive. So that's why we wanted to talk also
Discuss with
all
you.
together, because we don't feel that we are going to go until the last detail
Yeah.
of retouching every
To
single
finish
thing,
everything.
especially
Right.
because this painting is quite busy and vibrant in this area. So some of the losses in this area are a little
Yeah,
bit
okay.
less evident. They're like especially
Not so
super
distracting.
evident in this area, which
Yeah.
is really the main focus of the characters. So yeah, we wanted to also be able people to see when we're doing this process, because retouching is something that has also an ethical aspect, because some people tend to think that, oh, we're just artists painting around, and there's a lot of ethical also things that we need to keep in mind when we do this type of process. So in these areas of loss, we will never go beyond the loss area itself. So we don't come in with a palette and go,
And
oh,
they like-
let's just
yes.
paint. Well, there's no intention to imitate Pacita's strokes or Pacita's hand or anything like that. So we have different techniques that we use, which allow us to basically put back the color. Luckily in this painting, it's just color loss.
just-
There's no
it's
like,
true.
there's no like big concepts
Shapes
or
or
big
forms.
areas that we have to reconstruct, and so we just have to introduce the color, and then
Yeah,
Irene, earlier when we were talking, kind of having a conversation, you mentioned that when it was framed, it gave you a different experience of the work, it became heavier.
It became, yeah.
Can you
actually-
say more about that? I found that really a really
Yeah,
interesting
I mean,
comment.
because actually when you're going through the conservation process until it's not a stretch, actually you don't have a sense of how it feels. And I was not present when it was actually hung on the gallery. So seeing here, it gains definitely is a wonderful feeling, actually.
I mean, ideally, we would have wanted even a kind of a longer kind of a viewing distance, because it's a large
Yes.
painting.
Yeah.
But in this space, as you can see,
It's
quite a
short.
narrow space. But I think it's still good. It's still
Still
good.
possible to have an overview.
Before it was
yeah.
on the wall, we were a bit accepted, but now that we see
Yeah.
it,
Yes.
actually,
Yeah.
you can
It's
really,
And I was just wondering, Irene, your comment about it being heavy and now that it's framed, could also. I'm just wondering about looking at the eyes of all these people. I think it does give a certain sense of weightiness and heaviness to it. Like they are looking at you as you are looking at them, and it's very direct in how they're
Yeah,
looking.
you're right.
They're not looking to the left or looking to the
No,
right.
just directly.
Most of
yeah.
them, most
to
of them
you.
are looking directly, except for maybe some of the children. So that sense of being looked at, I think it's really powerful. The gaze is returned in that sense, right? As well. Yeah. Would there be any other areas that we want to kind of look at? Like, say I've always wondered about this foreground over here, because it sort of gives a sense that they are a bit floating in some ways. Yeah.
We were actually hoping that when we come here to the second phase, because we have techniques that allow us to see if there's underlayers. So we use normally infrared photography to observe if there's any if she sketched maybe before painting, which we actually think is probably not, because when you look at many of the edges of the characters, you can see that probably she just used a brush to sketch them, and then she
the outline
to
and
place all of them
yes.
and then start a painting. But we will bring the camera in, and then we will try to do some
Technical
some
examination
technical
of the-
examination to see if we can find anything, because placing all these people and sketching all of this and putting them all in these different layers and different dimensions without a previous drawing is also quite challenging,
Think so,
because the piece
yeah.
is very big, and just placing everybody there is also quite amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there could be like brush sketch, but there could also be some lines, some drawing. So that's something that we need further technique to be able to appreciate and examine.
Yeah, earlier we were having a conversation if we were wondering if Pacita but actually witnessed this scene of this crowd of refugees, actually coming in, maybe. We're not sure, but maybe not also. It could be something that she put together. I wish I could ask her. I have not come across any documentation of her saying that, she had actually witnessed this scene of refugees coming in. This could be like a montage also, perhaps, of all her different conversations with the refugees and kind of bringing it all together for the exhibition. in 1980, because this was the largest painting, while the rest were just kind of individual portraits, which are also very important and a point of the exhibition. But the magnitude of the crisis, I think, was something she also wanted to convey to the public. Yeah, so maybe at this point we will stop and ask if there are any questions from the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.